Alright folks, let's go ahead and get started here. I'm on a virtual machine right now because virtual machine has an RTX, so I'll be able to produce things at the same level as you guys fairly easily. Alright, if you give me about 30 minutes, we're going to talk about how to get your first landscape set up, and this should be fairly straightforward. There's nothing really magical about the setup for this, and we're going to sit down and talk about some of the tools and how to essentially get your first landscape set up. Talk about how all this works. So if you want to go ahead and start games, go into games, start a third person, and we want a third person because we want some guy in there for scale. Put it wherever you want, name it whatever you want, make sure we're not using any starter content, ray tracing turned off, desktop maximum, and go ahead and do create. Now is the time to actually pop open your, let me update my file. Pop open your Wacom and plug it in if that's your thing. I'm going to use the mouse because I think a majority of you are going to be using mice. If you have a touch interface, if it's not Wacom quality, you might get different results, but we'll kind of make this work however we're going to have it here. I'm going to go File, New Level. We're going to go into our default project, and we want to make sure that we have some stuff that we have set up already. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete my Sphere Reflection Capture Actor, and let me go ahead and kind of mess with my stuff here so I can see what's going on. Where's my world outliner? There we go. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and delete my sphere capture, and just for the purpose of this demo, I'm going to delete my atmospheric fog because I might add some stuff to it later. And I'm just going to go ahead and leave the landscape or the land piece alone. And I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that my time of day is set up to something at least a little bit reasonable. There we go, something like that. And then I'm going to set my intensity for like 10 lumens so that I can see what's going on. And then I'm going to leave my skylight at an intensity scale of 1. Okay. Let's go ahead and actually build our landscape now. You're going to go ahead and find your landscape stuff over at the very top at this button right here that's called Activate Landscape Editing Mode. First things first, once you click it, do not be scared. You're going to see this large kind of green projection start up, and then your landscape stuff is going to load up over here on the left. You have a bunch of different options. We have the Manage option, the Sculpt option, which obviously we have no landscape, and the Paint option. Both of these two options are contingent on a landscape being available. Over here we have the ability to create a new landscape, which by default, that's what we're actually making. Clicking on New here doesn't actually do anything because we're actually making that. It just reloads this window. And then we have a bunch of different tools that we can use once the landscape is already made. Down here, we have, let me go ahead and open this up a little bit so we can see what's going on. I'll make this a little bit bigger, and then I'll make this side a little smaller. So even though I'm losing a little bit of the screen, I think it's better that you guys can see. Okay. Over here on the left, we have the Enable Edit Layer Tools. This starts the support for layer editing inside of the Edit Layer tool. I'm not going to enable this by default because I'm going to show you guys what it actually does later and why it works, why it kind of sucks, and why it needs some improvement. You can start by putting a material inside of the landscape. You guys do not have access to a landscape material right now. We will make one at some point. The location of the landscape based on its coordinate position. Go ahead and hit Q there so I deselect that, don't want that selected. We have our section size, our sections per component, our number of components, our overall resolution, and our total components. We also have a button that says Fill World. Do not click on Fill World. Fill World will make an assessment to how much landscape can fit on your computer and will attempt to make a landscape that actually fills up your environment. This is generally an unsafe button to click on. The Create button, however, is not unsafe. Now, let's go ahead and discuss some of these options here as I bring up some of the documentation. The landscape itself is made of various components. where we have a yellow edge, which illustrates the landscape actor edge. We have a light green, which illustrates a component edge. As you can see, this is built off of 4 large components, light green. And then we have a medium green, which is our landscape section edge, and a dark green, which has our individual quads here. And these individual quads are how landscape works as a function inside of the Unreal Engine. As you can see, these are the components, these are the sections, and these are kind of like the little subsections that they use inside the component sections. The most important element on this particular page is Unreal and Epic does have a variety of sizes that work in terms of the binary amount of performance that you can get on a CPU or GPU. These settings work fairly well out of the box. The default setting is actually probably one of the easier ones to get started with. And in fact, we're probably going to go ahead and use the default settings to make our first landscape, because that's going to make our lives a little bit easier. And that way we don't have to worry about whether or not we are actually creating a landscape that fits the performance attributes. By default, the original landscape that pops up in the Unreal Engine by default is going to be as performant as possible for the particular scene that we have. So we'll probably play around with some of these sizes, but let me actually go ahead and hop back into the virtual machine and I can show you guys some elements here. By modifying the landscape section sizes, let me go ahead and zoom out, we can see how this is going to have an effect on the size of our environment. For example, setting up 7x7 quads allows us to create a smaller environment with smaller sections. Now, the scale for this is actually still fairly small, but the section size allows for better performance at all kinds of levels. Let me go ahead and set the default. And each of these different section sizes allows us to create different size components for a different size environment. Let's keep zooming out so we can see how this is actually working. We have 15x15, 31x31, 63x63, which is a default, 127, and 256. Let's go back to the default here so we can see its overall result. Now, the way that the engine split these up is actually where you get some of your performance modifications and allows you to kind of use the foliage tool to be able to place elements correctly. You only have access to 1x1 or 2x2 sections, where these sections are either set up as 1x1. So if we look at our geometry here, let's zoom in a little bit, we see that each individual section here, 63x63 quads. Let's go ahead and zoom in down here. We can see that each section is 63x63 based on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8x8 componentry system, which is what this is down here. By subdividing that into a 2x2 section, each of these individual sections get 2 additional subsections, 1, 2 by 1, 2, as you can see. Basically, the more componentry you have, the more you can aggressively cull and remove elements, especially for large sections of environment. So even though, for example, it looks like it's getting bigger, we are functionally still getting a larger resolution with functionally the same number of components, just subdivisions that allow us to cull things a little bit more aggressively. Components themselves, like I said, can be divided into a 1x1 or 1 to 4 2x2 sections. Now, the size of each section is still based on something called power of 2, but this allows us to add more aggressive subdivision sections. So if we need to say if this particular section, this has a higher resolution that allows us to aggressively remove things further ahead rather than focusing on a 1x1 section that only has its one section that can be brought in and out. So each of these 2 landscape components right here, this component and this component, they have to exist at the same time if you are not culling them aggressively. When you have a 2x2 section, you can actually, let me see if it'll, Kind of frozen right now. Sec. There we go. So because you can have subsections, these subsections can call each other before we actually get into the main section, which is kind of the benefit of having a higher resolution ground, but I find that it's not necessarily the most important element to have in your landscape. We won't worry too much about sections per component because generally a 1x1 section should be enough for us unless we need higher resolution for our height maps. This is usually set by what kind of height map or what kind of blending or what kind of geometry that we're building for the height map. Let's keep it simple. We'll keep it 63 by 63 by 8 by 8. Your number of components also changes and affects the size of the environment. Now, because you are using power of 2, generally speaking, again, as far as performance considerations, you should keep the total number of components as square as possible in order to keep these component sections relatively easy and performant. By default, this should be good enough for what we need for our first initial landscape, and at the very least gives us something that'll perform well on your guys' machine without having to worry about which sections and which size you can set up. If you need to set up something obscene, you could set up something like I guess 255 components, and then of course modify the resolution based on the overall resolution in here in terms of vertices, where one vertice is 1 meter, essentially, is how it works. One vertice is 1 meter in distance. So this is 2041 by 2041 meters, if I remember my science correctly for this. Let's not deal too much in here because this is going to be just used to kind of instantiate and create your landscape. This is fine for what it is. This is okay. So based on what I said previously, the default landscape is 505 meters by 505 meters. That should be enough for our first small patch of landscape. All right. There is an import from file button. I will cover that in a future demo to showcase how you can import your own custom height maps if you have your own height map to work with. Let's go ahead and start by creating our first landscape. Make sure you have 60 by 63, 1 by 1, and we'll go from there. I think that's going to give us the best overall size. Okay, let's go ahead and hop right in, create, by hitting the create button. Now if we go ahead and hit play, let's play, come on. Oh, might have fallen through the world here. Let's go ahead and see where my third person guy is. Now as you can see, we have this kind of ring that's kind of flying around here. I'm going to go back into editing mode, and we're going to go ahead and grab the stuff that got placed underneath the map, and I'm going to press W, and I'm going to move it up so that it's placed properly, and then I'm going to play again. And I'm going to create a quick material here so we can always find that. Let's go ahead and I'm going to create a new folder. You guys don't have to do this. Come on. And I'll just create orientation material. And this will just be a 3 constant with a red in it. Okay, that'll work for now. And then I'm just going to drag that onto there. Okay, moving a little fast here for my liking. Okay. Zip play. And now we can see that our environment is actually loaded and we have a whole lot of nothing. But we can see how relatively large this default landscape is supposed to be. This landscape is fairly big for what we have. So this will be okay for our purposes. Let's go ahead and zoom out and kind of have a look to see where we ran that far and we only made it about halfway through that section. That's okay. Let's go ahead and go back in the landscape tools here. And let's go ahead now and observe that now that there is a landscape in the engine, the system actually recognizes that a landscape has been placed. If we go back to the Manage tab, we actually have the ability to modify the size and shape of the landscape by selecting these particular sections and then deciding what to do with particular types of data. In this case, we have the ability to create a new landscape. We have the ability to import landscape data from another project. We have a selection tool. We have the ability to add components. We have the ability to delete components. We have the ability to move the landscapes to something called a landscape proxy. Now, this is not something that we're going to cover right now. So you can see it's blown up a little bit. Essentially, what this allows us to optimize the performance of the landscape, because what we can do is we can load sections of the landscape out. But I'm not going to cover that in this particular demo. That's a little bit more advanced than what we need. We have the ability to resize our components. So if we click on that, we can resize this within reason. And we have access to something called the splines tool. Now, we'll use this tool later, but in kind of like a different method. I'll showcase that in a demo here in a little bit. Let's go ahead and go back to the Sculpt tab. The Sculpt panel is, by and large, where a majority of the work that we can do actually happens in this particular system. For starters, you can see that I have this lovely ring that is selected by default. By default, if we are in the Sculpt tab and we have the landscape editing mode selected, we can sculpt simply by left-clicking. Or if you're using a Wacom pen, go ahead and try this now. Go ahead and just touch the environment. And you can see that the environment does in fact react to your sculpting. Now, because we're not sculpting in layers and we're sculpting essentially in kind of like a more traditional sense, pressing Ctrl-Z will undo your landscape touches and your landscape sculpts. This is what makes the tool relatively powerful when it comes to using sculpting inside of the editor. We also have the ability to change our brush type. For example, we have a brush type for circular brush. We can assign an alpha brush. In this particular example, we don't have very many alphas. Let me go ahead and grab this. Everybody sees that I can kind of create that stamp. So an alpha brush is similar to kind of how ZBrush has its own alpha toolkits. Let me just undo this a couple times. We have a pattern brush that essentially paints using a certain pattern based on its resolution size. So we can see that if we sculpt, we're painting based on the tiling of this particular object. Let me hit Ctrl-Z to undo that a few times. Okay. And we can change the size of a few things over here. And of course, we have something called Work with Entire Landscape Components. This is kind of newer in UE5. This allows you to kind of select components and work with their entire components. I don't know why this would be useful, but it exists. So there you go. That does exist. We also have the ability to control things like fall off. Let me Ctrl-Z that a few times because it looks like we left some stuff behind. Okay. We also have the ability to control things like brush fall off. So if we make a stroke, we can see kind of the behavior of that stroke. If we change the fall off changes to create a slightly different type of fall off in relation to how our brush stroke is going to affect the landscape. This looks more like a clay buildup or a clay tubes, if you guys remember those from ZBrush. And of course we have a tall tail tip off, which allows us to create things like really intense kind of tips as opposed to just creating kind of smooth objects. So this builds up more aggressively, so to speak. Let's go ahead and back this up a few times. Alright. Personally, I use the smooth fall off for now. So as you paint, I'm holding down left click. Holding down shift will allow you to paint down whatever it is you're painting in the other direction. It is essentially a flip tool. Holding down control will allow you to apply a Well, holding down control, excuse me, it used to actually apply a smoothing filter. It doesn't actually apply that smooth filter anymore. It's just a buildup. So I apologize for that. Ignore that last statement. That one used to be in UE4. But we can build up, and by shift, we can push things back down. And this makes our lives a little bit easier when it comes to sculpting on this particular landscape. We cannot apply a smooth, unfortunately, without actually physically moving to the smooth button. There used to be a smooth button, there used to be a smooth hotkey, but unfortunately it looks like it's been shifted over into an actual smooth command for UE5. Let's go ahead and test a few things out here so we can kind of see what's going on. We can affect the brush size by modifying the brush settings over here, or if you are using the bracket keys, so your bracket keys will look like this. And they're going to be next to your enter key. The bracket keys are how you can stage up and stage down the size of your brush as well. That has an effect overall over here. We can reset the size. By default, the brush size is going to be 2048. And the size of the fall off can also be affected. Now, if we select the size of the fall off, we can see how the brush becomes harder and softer at certain edges. And we can get the effects that we want based on what our fall off is supposed to be. We can get a very, very soft brush, or we can get a much, much harder brush. The clay brush allows you to use a clay painting mode, because what it does is it applies something called an average. This is really nice for filling in gaps and making holes. Generally speaking, I almost never use it, but if for some reason you need to be able to cut into the map, now you can't actually physically cut a hole until you actually set up a material that accepts a section of your landscape as being a hole, but we can talk about that in the future. I generally don't like using clay brush. The clay brush works by looking at the average direction of all the faces that are under the mouse, or in this case a Wacom, and then moving the vertices in the average direction. Because of this, the clay brush is good at filling in gaps and creating holes in landscape. I'll probably try it out, but that shouldn't give us too much of an effect, I don't think. Let's go ahead and very quickly paint out some things. I'm going to go ahead and return my brush to kind of like a slightly harder brush here. And I'm going to up the scale of my brush, and then I'm going to up the tool strength. The tool strength is what makes the tool very, very powerful. Typically speaking, I usually paint at anywhere from a 2.5 or lower, because the effect is a build-up effect. But we can talk about that in a sec. I'm just going to make something quick and dirty. I'm going to increase the power of the landscape, and then I'm just gonna paint some things in so we can actually start testing some of the stuff out. Oh, hit shift to bring that back down. So just paint out some mountains and some valleys. Just kind of go in there and just sculpt some ugly things. I'll show you guys how to actually sculpt the landscape by hand once you actually get an opportunity. Once we actually get an opportunity to sculpt some out. So just go ahead and build up some things. If you're curious for how big it's going to look, go ahead and hit play, and then you get an idea of how the scale is going to look in the scene. And then we can go back out and then just start building some things up if we need to. So I'm just going to build some things up so that I can test some things out and show you what the effects of the brushes are. The smooth brush is fairly straightforward. It applies a smoothing algorithm to everything in the scene. That's it. And it is contingent on strength, so the stronger your smooth, the more aggressive it will smooth. You need to have some smooth, otherwise it's not going to do anything. The filter kernel radius is about preserving details. The higher the value, the more, well, you can read it right here. Higher values smooth out bigger details. Lower values smooth out only smaller details. So if we set this down to a lower value, and then we attempt to smooth out some of these sections, you see that these sections resist being smoothed out a little bit more. That's all it does. The detail smooth is a little bit different. Sorry, I had to sneeze there. The detail smooth allows you to how can I explain this? The detail smooth attempts to preserve tiny micro details. So the higher this value, as it says in the tooltip right there, the more you're going to preserve smaller details. This is basically fine control on the smooth settings. I'll show this one a little bit later, although I typically don't use the detail smooth very often. If I do use it, I use it to like smooth out. I use this to kind of smooth out certain areas, but typically speaking, I'll have this at a very low percentage, and then I'll smooth out around some of my crevasses. And it's generally just to preserve little tiny areas. This works in conjunction with the filter radius, so essentially you'll want to set your, depending on what your target is, if you want to kill your larger or your smaller forms, you'd set that up in here, and the detail smooth enabled will allow you to smooth out either your large forms or your super small forms. That's it. You remove more detail the higher up you go, and you remove fewer details lower. This is basically just fine control for the filter kernel radius. Let's disable that. Flatten works exactly as you think. This is kind of similar to terracing, but what it does is depending on where you click, so for example, if I clicked up here, it's going to average out the height of that particular area when clicked to allow me to control the overall height and macing of this particular section. So the flatten tool can be used to create things like terraces, can be used to create elements that look like terracing. Let's go ahead and open up the advanced toolkit, and then we'll kind of talk our way through this. Now, you still always have access to your other brush types. Your landscape editor always has access to brush type and brush fall off. These kinds of things are going to be important depending on what you're trying to sculpt. I don't worry too much about these so much because, again, generally the landscape is not going to be something that I'm going to spend a lot of time sculpting a lot of details on. I want to get my general forms, and then of course if I'm going to go back and start editing like aggressively to make my environment look good, then maybe I'll go back and actually play around with this. But just know that you can edit the brush type and you can edit the brush fall off, but you cannot have the same level of control that you have in ZBrush. Your flatten target will allow you to select a section that you can flatten towards. So for example, if we select our flatten target right here, we can see that that kind of grid shows up. That is showcasing where our flatten target is going to be, and by modifying that, oh, I pushed it a little bit too low, sorry. We can see where the flatten is going to attempt to build up or push down to. Let's go ahead and reset that and deselect that. Tool strength works the same way that you think. It's just the power of the tool. The flatten mode here allows us to change things like both raising, well, by default, both will raise and lower at the same time. Raise will only raise up to a certain area, but will not lower other heights. So as you can see, it will not lower the heights from this particular section right here. Lower only lowers, but does not raise. Interval is a little bit different. This is mostly for the terracing tool. What this does is it finds the closest terrace level and will flatten it. I'll showcase this one here in a sec. And of course, a terrace tool. Now both of these work with the terracing. I'll showcase that here shortly. Use slope flatten or slope flattening. I said slope fattening in one of the edits. Allows you to select a point on the map. So for example, this area right here, and allows us to flatten the slope based on that particular slope, like so. Fairly useful tool if you know what you do. If you know what you want to do with it. Works fairly well with the ramp tool that we're going to showcase here shortly. We delete that. pick value per apply is kind of strange. It will auto-update based on the location of the mouse, so it will not always give a full... You see how the result is slightly different? If we move, it kind of picks a new height to work with. I don't know why anyone would want to do the pick value per apply, but that just kind of shows kind of how it works, right? I wouldn't use the pick value per apply. Slope flatten is usually pretty useful. Flatten target ties with the preview grid down here, so we can worry about the preview grid here shortly. But essentially what that does is by setting up our preview grid, select this height here. There we go. We can see that the preview grid can be set up. By disabling the preview grid, all that does is disables the grid as a whole. This is only available in UE5, not UE4, so my UE4 guys, I apologize, this kind of stuff is not available to you. At least the preview grid is not. Let's go ahead and reset that. Turn that off. As you can see, that is tied to that particular switch, so that doesn't come back on. Actually, I just checked, and in 4.2.6 they did in fact introduce the show preview grid and stuff. So this should be available for everybody. It's just going to be located in a slightly different window. You guys will have your stuff up here, whereas the UE5 guys will have theirs in this section over here. So that's my bad. Let me go ahead and set up some terracing here and see if I can get something to work good. Let's set up a terrace interval like 500, and terrace moving can be a default. So let's see if this will give us something that can work here. Set up a terrace, and there we go. Does everybody see kind of how that works? Yes, I know the lighting is really ugly. This is usually indicative of the fact that we're actually running out of resolution for sculpting these kinds of elements. I would probably smooth that. I would smooth this aggressively. But the terrace essentially allows you to create terraces based on whatever interval that you want. Here's a bigger terrace right here. It's set much smaller terraces. It's probably too small to create terraces. Let's add a 250. There we go. So you see kind of how the terracing can work. And you see that it creates lighting errors in Lumen because Lumen doesn't like stuff like this. But you can see kind of how this rigid setup is going to help kind of change those values as well. How can I explain interval? Interval will try to flatten to the closest terrace is what it does. So if we're on this particular terrace right here, we can see that we can flatten to it, or we can flatten to that one, or we can flatten to that one, or we can flatten to that one. It essentially just decides how to flatten the terrace based on whatever specific terrace interval. These two have to work together, although it's not usually listed correctly. Setting this up by default actually doesn't have a different effect. This lets you pick the terrace that you're on to be able to flatten to. So let me go ahead and zoom in here. So if we want to flatten to this particular terrace, we can. And it corrects our terracing based on that. That's it. That's all it does. And of course, we have our brush size and our brush fall off. So that's going to go ahead and wrap up the explanation for the flatten. Let's go ahead and hop over to the ramp tool. Boom. The ramp tool is fairly simple. By selecting the ramp tool and selecting 2 points, you can change things like the width of the ramp and of course the ramp fall off. But once you actually have this item created, we can go ahead and move this around and bring it around here and try to make it work a little bit better. This is a great way to add a very simple, straightforward ramp. Now, as you can see, it made kind of an ugliness up here. We can select this icon right here. We can kind of fix that, and we can add the ramp. And there we go. We have a ramp that the player can theoretically go back into place mode and then play from here, that the character can run up. That's all it does. It's actually a fairly basic tool. but still an incredibly powerful and useful tool. Let's go back into the landscape editor. And that's really all it does. There's no real sections to do in it. Nothing really else to do with it. It creates ramps. By hitting reset, it resets the 2 points. And adding ramp adds a ramp. Now, if you notice, it does cut in depending on where this ramp is supposed to go. So if we have this place in this mountain, and we add a ramp, we see that the ramp does, in fact, cut into the ground. So just bear that in mind. Oh, and for those of you who are curious, clicking on these buttons while they're freaking out like this allows you to open up little tutorials about the UI itself, but they're not always generally super useful. So if you feel inclined to click on it, go ahead. If not, let's move on. We're getting to my favorite tools now. Oh, reset please, thank you. Now there can be a bug with the ramp tool where the ramp will persist when you change the tool. If it does, just go back and reset it, and then we can go ahead and change our tool. And that should be fairly straightforward. So one of my favorite tools is the erosion tool. The erosion tool is relatively complex and deep, and to cover all of these individual elements would probably take a little bit longer than I'd like it to. But let me go ahead and try, for the sake of trying to explain how this works, in order to get a result that I think we're going to be happy with. Erosion, as a theory, is the natural erosion from heat erosion. This is thermal erosion. As you can read, it simulates erosion caused from the movement of soil from higher areas to lower areas. And this is applied using a noise pattern that is built inside of the engine. It does a relatively good job of faking some erosion. Let's go ahead and move someplace where there might actually be some better erosion, like maybe over here. And I'll go ahead and leave some of these settings alone, and we're just gonna touch this. So I'm gonna go ahead and increase the size of my brush, and we're just gonna kind of touch these mountains here. That's a little too aggressive. Let's bring this down pretty far. So we can see how that effect, even lower strength here, creates almost like kind of like a ripped kind of weird effect that simulates some of the stuff that you might see on actual mountain surfaces. That's what the erosion is supposed to do. Erosion helps create these kinds of crevasses and small details that can fake the behavior and the effect of overall mountain surfaces. If we back this off enough, we'll see the difference here. See? We go from that to something like this. Erosion is probably one of the most powerful tools that I know of for this, because this allows you to create some pretty good looking landscapes by default, as you can see. Let's go ahead and talk about some of these settings in order to get something that we can work with. Again, a lot of these settings are somewhat arbitrary. Other programs do this better, but if we're going to be focused entirely on Unreal Engine and on those solutions, we need to understand what's happening. Let me go ahead and set my tool strength back to default, and let's talk about threshold. Now, threshold is the minimum height in centimeters that there needs to be in the landscape in order for erosion to happen. Since there's not a lot of noise on this particular environment, it's going to be important to understand that this effect might look a little bit bad, but the higher number that you have here, the less erosion you are going to get. So as you can see, smaller values will result in more erosion. Larger values prevent a lot of the erosion from happening, and it focuses on certain areas. In this particular case, it's looking for 128, and I don't think you can put a higher number in there. Nope, highest you can put is 356. And it looks for that number in order to create erosion. Let's go ahead and back that off a little bit and check the results. And let's set this value back down to maybe 1, or closer to 8. There you go. See how much more erosion you get? It's not necessarily strength, but what it does is it tries to erode the environment in such a way that is going to functionally try to mimic what the threshold is supposed to be. So this is more or less your height threshold. The surface thickness affects the threshold as well. Think of surface thickness as a modifier for the threshold. A higher surface thickness will resist more erosion. This effect doesn't always become visible and is usually used to add a little bit of modifier. By default, it sets at 256. I almost never change it, but what happens is by setting up your threshold, this is the value by which it applies your threshold. So the thicker your surface, so for example, if you are using more of a rock type surface, you're going to want to double or triple this in order to have more erosion, in order to prevent the erosion from basically decimating all of your rocks. Iterations is pretty straightforward. This is based on how many subdivisions the ground is going to get. Essentially, if you want more erosion on your surface than the default threshold and tool strength are giving you, you want to pump up this value. Now, it's hard to demonstrate because they don't really showcase a whole lot when we have like a basic landscape, but essentially what you want to do is, if you need more erosion, it will attempt to add more erosion to the settings that you have up here. And what it does is it subdivides the geometry a little bit more aggressively, but it takes longer to do so. I generally don't mess around with this because the results are more, you can see kind of the difference in the results. This still has a little bit creamier of a look, and this has a much more aggressive flattening. I'm just pressing the button once. I'm not holding it. I'm not like multi-clicking it. You can see how the effect is different based on how many iterations we're adding. You see how it's not pulverizing the ground as hard? It's kind of hard to illustrate these behaviors because these behaviors are generally used to modify each other. So tool strength and threshold and surface thickness and iterations all work together. I almost never mess with these settings. Your noise mode also controls how the noise is being applied. By default, erosion is going to be downwards. But if you need something a little bit more dynamic, a setting of both can actually raise and lower the geometry at will to create much more dynamic systems. Let's undo that. And you can raise or lower. Raising, I don't know why you would want to raise erosion. It creates kind of an awkward effect, but it's there. And of course your noise scale. This is the scale of the purlin noise used. This is the hidden texture that's actually creating the noise. The larger the resolution, the larger your kind of carved are going to be, versus the smaller the resolution, the more noise you're going to get in your sculpts. That's it. So generally I don't mess with this. I will either set this a little bit higher to get slightly chunkier sculpts. As you can see, the noise is a little bit bigger. It's more visible. And the smaller this number is, the less noise that you're going to get. You can still see some noise, obviously, but the noise will be smaller in scale. Let's go up even higher. Set this down to lower. Yep. You see you get bigger chunks. And as we go smaller, we get kind of more noise. Let's go back down to here. Again, these are all like really subtle effects. I'm not a fan of some of these, but they exist. So generally speaking, I usually set a relatively low strength and I start eroding elements to kind of get a kind of interesting look that I'm looking for. Hydro erosion is more or less the same, except the difference between regular erosion and hydro erosion is that we get a rain amount. Let's go ahead and try to paint out some of the erosion here. So what it's doing is it's looking at areas where water can collect, and the hydro erosion is going to attempt to mimic what water settling in certain areas looks like. So as you can see, those lower lying areas is where the water would kind of carve out into, and that's where the water would kind of end up. That's it. that's more or less how it works. There's not much really to it. It just carves in sections that the water might actually carve in. Rain amount controls how much rain. Larger values give you more erosion. Smaller values give you less erosion. This is the more or less your rain amount. This is very similar to the threshold from the regular thermal erosion. Let's undo some of these settings here because I just carved up this environment. Okay. The sediment cap is more or less the same thing as the surface thickness. The sediment cap, the higher the value, the more erosion, the more settling that you're going to get at the bottom. So we set that up. We see that a higher sediment cap raises the amount of erosion that we're getting at the bottom. That's it, even if some of that erosion doesn't actually make any sense. So it detects how far away the cap of the sediment is, and it tries to make erosion that's based on that. If we undo that, hit Z a couple times, we see that we're not getting that dramatic of an effect. We're only getting a few chunks right here, and then much less over here. Iterations is the same thing as in the previous for erosion, where iterations controls the number of subdivisions that you get. The higher, the more erosion. Same thing with iterations down here. The higher, the more erosion. Initial rain distribution. This one's a little bit strange. Essentially, the rain distribution controls whether or not you get rain in... Well, basically, if it rains, like it says, rains in some places and not in others randomly. By setting it to positive, this will act as though it's rained everywhere on the painted area at the same time and will paint all parts of the map as though it's being blasted by water. Rain is actually a little bit more like both. See, rain is applied to the entire area. Rain is in some places and not in others. Technically, both would be the physically correct one, but positive gives you a slightly different effect. That's really it. Don't want to talk about anything. Rain distance scale, or rather rain distribution scale. This is very similar to noise scale. That's really it. The size of the noise filter essentially gets applied to the size of the rain, and then the noise filter, what this is, rain distribution scale. Basically what it does is it applies a noise filter. That's it. It's related to the position and scale. That's it. Not changing it doesn't give too much of an effect. Changing the values here essentially changes how much rain gets applied in a section when you are using the initial rain distribution as set to both. The larger your scale, the softer your forms. The smaller your scale, the more noisy some of your forms are going to be. That's basically it. Detail Smooth tries to perform a smoothing effect as it rains. So some of the softness that we've been getting in these particular areas right here have been attempted to be smoothed by the Detail Smooth, and that's really all there is to it. I don't necessarily like hydro erosion too much, but again, because you can always undo this stuff and then always go back and say smooth this area out down here, bring it back up. See, you can always fix a lot of the things that erosions cause. So if you really mess up, you can always smooth things back out and try again. Noise is one of my favorite ones because noise allows you to create just about everything that you need in terms of the kind of the randomness that helps when generating the noise for your particular terrain. I usually like to apply noise everywhere on a map whenever I'm actually creating my first environment, which is actually quite nice, right? We've already talked about tool strength here. Let me actually raise the strength back to 0.3. And we can see that if we make a relatively large brush, whoa, that's a little too strong. I'm sorry. Let's actually go down. We can see that it creates some random noise. That's all it is. Instead of sculpting out the noise, you see that it creates just a random amount of noise. The target value is fairly straightforward. If it's checked, it blends the value of the noise towards whatever target value you have. I don't find that it creates much of an effect that I can use, but it is what it is. Turn that off. Let's reset that. Turn that off. The noise mode will determine how to apply all of the noise effects, either with both adding and subtracting, or either adding or subtracting. Subtracting just puts your noise down. Adding just adds your noise up. And of course, noise scale controls the size of the noise filter. The smaller, the noisier. Very similar to how erosion has the distribution scale and the noise mode. The smaller, the noisier. That's basically it. See? Fairly straightforward. One of my favorite tools to actually get started with. Now let me make something really ugly here. Whoa! We don't want that. Let's do something like this. Make something real ugly here. Low strength. Both. Very noisy. Okay. The next tool is the retopology tool. Retopology, or retopo, or retopology. I always say retopology, so just ignore me. Retopology is the process of solving some of the stretching issues that you might come into when you are looking at very intense and extreme changes in the texture map. So does everybody see that particular area right there? Let's see if I can move the brush. There we go. We can see that area has some kind of stretching. That is going to translate into our texture. And if our texture can't tolerate a lot of stretching, what it's going to do is it's going to try to solve some of these weight issues so that it attempts to smooth out some of these issues. Let me see if I can make that a little bit smaller. It's kind of hard to tell on that. Let me actually go back to the flatten and then make some terraces over here, and we'll see if we can get something that looks okay. Oh. Usually terraces and things that have really, really sharp fall-offs will have a significant amount of stretching, and that significant amount of stretching is what causes issues. Let's see if we can do that. Now this tool doesn't always work. It tries its best to try to solve issues like this. Let me go ahead and bring the brush size down. Does everybody see kind of how it's trying to massage the stretching? It's not going to solve every problem. You see how it's straining, and this doesn't have a strength modifier. What it's designed for are areas that might be overly stretched, and then those can be slightly massaged out. You can see kind of how we're improving the stretching here a little bit. Let's look at this area over here. Set that very slightly. We see that we are applying, by seeing kind of the shadow up here, we are applying some kind of smoothness. And you see we've gotten rid of all of our terracing. See? Let's try to smooth that a little bit. See? That's what retopology does. Retopology attempts to fix your vertical offset so that any texture stretching is attempted to be repaired. It is basically a smooth, but without as much power or control. It's basically your first line of defense against high stretching. So if your map is starting to stretch aggressively like this in certain areas, you might want to think about applying a retopology, or you might want to think about applying a smooth. These areas here will end up looking terrible because that's just kind of how these areas look. See, now that I've retopologized it a little bit, it looks a little better. And we still have some terracing, we still have bumps, but you see kind of there's a give and take in relation to the environment here. Visibility is not going to be one that we use because if we look over on the bottom left, note, there are some areas where visibility painting is disabled because the component proxy doesn't have a landscape visibility mask node in their material. This is how you would paint a literal hole in your environment. If I need to actually make a hole in my environment, I generally will kind of build out a square and then like build a static mesh into it and like develop a hole. This is not something that I see gets used very often, and it's a demo that I don't. In order to set the landscape material up, we would have to set up the landscape material, and then we would have to set this up with a hole, and then we would be able to paint a hole. This does not work out of the box. I would stay away from it for now. All right, let's keep going. The mirror tool is actually quite useful. The mirror tool allows you to mirror sections of the map. Let's fly over here. So that sides of the map can be symmetrical, right? So in this particular case, we can change our mirror point. Let's recenter that. And then we can change the position of our this. Oh, I'm accidentally, let's recenter our mirror point. And then we can change our operations to see what direction the landscape is going to mirror in. And in this particular case, we might want to mirror in the pause direction. And if we hit apply, we see that the map is mirrored on both sides. So there you go. We've now made a MOBA. That's basically how it works. The smoothing width is fairly straightforward. What this does is it tries to create a smoothness in the center between one landscape to the other. Usually applying some here will kind of soften some of the center part that you might add. I usually add a little bit. And it tries to create a softness in between. That works a little bit. Let's Control Z that and raise that and then apply. See, so we get a much, much softer result, or a very, very hard result. Typically, I apply some value in here before I do any kind of like mirroring, because then I can get something that looks like that. And that's how you mirror your map. So instead of having to resculpt an entire section, this actually works fairly well for just kind of making a map on one side and then mirroring those sections over, and then the landscape will be able to adhere to that. And of course, our operations are based on what side that we want to paint to. And the arrow shows which direction this side is going to paint on this side, based on that side will paint on this side. So if we could apply that, see, so it's fairly straightforward. Let me undo that a couple times. Recenter that. Cool. And let's move on. All right. The select tool is actually fairly useful. So these last two tools, the select and the copy tools, work together. So let me go ahead and showcase that. The select tool is similar to a mask tool, where if we select a section here, so let's go ahead and select that, and let me go ahead and return my strength back to 0.3. So I'm going to go ahead and, if you guys see this visual bug, clear region selection and then just kind of select something. So we're going to select this area over here, and we're just going to mask this out. Now, the nice thing with this is because this area is masked out, and if we try to sculpt it, it actively resists being sculpted on. See that? Let's go ahead and go back to our select and clear the selection region. Does everybody see how it's avoided being selected? It even has like a nice little cutout. The select tool is basically just a mask tool that allows us to mask out certain areas. That's it. We can also do a negative mask, which allows us to clean up certain areas, and then we can focus on only this particular area. And by default, use region as mask is the prerequisite for using it as part of the copy tool. I would not disable this. You should almost always use region as mask unless you are going to use this mask as just nothing more than a very basic, I don't want to paint here. That's it. All it does is mask things out. If we go over here into select and hold Control-Alt, we see that it explains it. However, this is the old documentation. you don't actually have to hold control. Oh, let me clear that selection. You don't actually have to hold control to paint, and holding down shift lets you unpaint things. Now, if you get an error like that again, just clear your selection region. It's just a weird error with how it operates. They need to fix this, I think. It's been having this issue for a while now, but all it does is it just allows you to just paint things out and mask them off so that they're not affected. However, for example, let's say we like something. I'm going to go ahead and mask out this particular area over here. Let's say I like this one mountain right here, right? All right, that's masked out. Cool, that's good. Let's go to the copy tool. Now the copy tool allows me to copy data to this particular gizmo. Let's go ahead and fit this gizmo to the selected region. Look at that. So I use the select tool to select this particular area, and then I fit the gizmo to the select regions. Now I can go ahead and copy this data to the gizmo, and then watch this as I move this over. As I move this over somewhere else. Let's go ahead and move this over here. Let's go ahead and move this over here. Close enough. And now, because this tool is ready to receive some amount of work, we have our tool strength, we have our region stuff. Let's go back to the copy tool, sorry. I can go ahead and then, quote unquote, paste that element by painting it in. Usually what I'll do is I'll increase the brush strength and then touch the entire thing. So what it's doing is it's pasting down our tool, and then as you can see, bam, that mountain is now over here. And we can move and affect this gizmo and keep pasting this wherever we want. I'm going to go ahead and smooth some of this area out down here. The smooth is probably a little too aggressive because the brush is too strong. But now we have put that mountain. Let's clear my selection. See it? This mountain is now over here. And that's kind of a quick and dirty way to use the copy tool. Let's go ahead and actually manipulate the copy tool a little bit. So as you can see, it can be manipulated to allow you to scale and change the overall size of the gizmo. Fitting the height values to the gizmo also attempts to modify. As you can see, it scales the data to fit the gizmo's Z size. This is a little bit different than just scaling the gizmo. The gizmo itself is a fairly useful tool. Oh, I might have just crashed the engine. Hold on. Yeah, you can see how this kind of stuff can get really, really weird sometimes. We'll give it a moment. Oh, we're back. Oh, looks like the gizmo has gotten real weird. Let's select the gizmo. There we go. Fitting the height values will attempt to fit the values of the object that has now been scaled to a new gizmo size. So if you've changed the overall scale of the gizmo, the object itself is not going to be correct. You can go ahead and fit that data. You can also clear the gizmo data. You can fit the gizmo to the selected region. Let's actually expand on the region a little bit. Watch this. Let's copy this data. As you can see, this data got copied, but the gizmo is not representative of the overall size. We can go ahead and fit those values to that actual height, and then we can go ahead and paint this down. Make my brush really big here. And then we'll paint that data in. And then we'll clear the selection. And we'll move the brush, and there we go. We have our nice, awesome looking mountain that is based on that little hill that we selected initially. So that's kind of how the select and copy tools work. As you can see, the copy tools allow you to use use these two as other tools. Leave that selected if you plan on using select and copy a lot. And generally speaking, this is using the select tool as a subtool, and the actual tool setting is right here. So generally speaking, I just kind of leave this alone when I'm making copies, but you can paste all layers, you can snap gizmo to a landscape grid. I generally don't spend too much time with this particular gizmo unless I make like one specific section of a mountain that I really, really enjoy. Typically speaking, I will use this to copy certain elements, but at that point you're spending a lot of time. Clear the region selection. on just working on a single element for your landscape. I don't feel like you should be spending too much time on your landscape. If I was going to build out something like this would probably be the limit, because as we can see, we're getting some stretching problems over here. Let's go the ret topology tool. Let's see if we can fix some of these stretching issues. Some of them are being fixed. Just kind of massage it down, see if we can solve some of those problems. That's a pretty good example of using the ret topology tool. Oh yeah, here we go. Let's see if we can fix that a little bit. See, this is too extreme. This is gonna be very, very hard to fix. And at that point, I would probably use a smooth tool to smooth out some of these areas, and then just solve those problems as they come up. Same thing with this area right here, really ugly. Ret topology tool, see if we can solve that. It's attempting to solve that, but you can see that the stretching is really intense there. Let's see if we can keep applying ret topology to get something that works. And if not, I would have to go back and then smooth this particular area. A few touches to see if I could solve some of the stretching here. There we go, that's a little bit better. Alright. So this has been your primer on making and using the tools inside of the landscape. Everything else is as I've explained. You always have access to things like your brush types. I would say if you're beginning, go ahead and leave your stuff alone. And I'm going to go ahead and do a demo here of making your first landscape. It'll take about 40 minutes, but I think overall it should be fairly straightforward, and then we'll keep chugging along. Alright, I will see you guys in the next demo.